Alright, welcome back. Let's first open up the project. First, we open PyCharm and load our project. As you can see here, Django has created some basic file for us after we created the modeling app. If your project looks different than mine, you can download all the files that are included in the course material. But after you downloaded the file, you will have to first install the virtual environment and some Python dependency libraries including Django. Let me show you. After we decompress the files, let's open up your terminal and go to the project folder. You might have noticed that the virtual environment folder is no longer there. That is because I didn't include it. Because your operating system and Python version may be different than mine. To avoid potential conflict, it is best that you install your own virtual environment. Let's first create your virtual environment and activate it. Next, notice that there is a file called requirements.txt. Inside it are all the Python libraries that we need to install. To install it, let's simply run pip install-r requirements.txt. Finally, let's run the server and make sure everything is right. Looks like the server was started successfully. Everything looks great. Let's first make some changes to the apps.py file that comes with the modeling app. The apps.py file holds our modeling app's configuration and metadata, and it is where we're going to load the model into the memory of the server. It is actually very important that we only use apps.py to load our model, because loading the model actually takes some time. And the nice thing about loading the model and configuring the model inside of the apps.py file is that we only need to load the model once. Then we can reuse the model anywhere else inside of the apps. If we load the model, let's say, inside of the views.py file, the model will have to be reloaded every time someone hit our endpoint, which will cause significant delays of the server, and also completely unnecessary, since the model file has now changed between each reload. Let's first install Ipython, which will give us a lot of bells and whistles and very helpful functions to run Python in the command line. Now let's open up our Python shell. A nice thing about Django is that if we can use Python managed shell, and it will open up a Python console with all the Django project configurations loaded already. Remember I told you that loading the model into the memory takes a significant amount of time. Let me show you. It takes about 1 second to load the model into the memory. Imagine you have thousands of visits to your website. If we put the model loading script inside of the views function, we might have to delay thousands of seconds. That's why I emphasize putting the model loading process inside of the apps.py file, so we only need to load the model once. Now let's see some examples of the predicted results. The model has a built-in predict function, so that if you feed in an array of text to it, the model will return an array of predicted results. And if the result is 0, that means a negative sentiment. If the result is 1, then it's a positive sentiment. Let's see a few examples. For the first example, we're using a fake review. I hate this movie. And we're expecting to get a negative sentiment results. We're supposed to get a result of 0. And the model successfully predicted negative sentiment in this review. Let's try another one. It is a total waste of 2 hours, and it is going to be a negative sentiment review. We're supposed to get a result of 0. Looks like the model is right this time again. Now let's try a different example. Let's give it a positive sentiment. This movie is great. I really liked it. Again, the model successfully predicted the expected results. And for our API server, we don't want to serve the result as 0 or 1. Instead, let's use Python ternary to convert the results into something that is more digestible by human being. Let's call it positive if the model results is 1. Otherwise, we're gonna assign it as negative. Now it's time to start editing apps.py file and load the model into our server. We first import OS and job.lib so that we can load the model files. We then construct the path of the model file. Notice that it is actually in the same directory of this apps.py file. And _file, is an attribute, so that when Python loads this apps.py file, it allows us to construct the absolute path of this file. Then we can use that to derive the path of our model file. We then use job.lib to load the model file. And to make sure that the model file is loaded successfully, we're adding a print statement so that we can see when the model is loaded. Let's go back to the terminal to make sure everything is right. Seems like something's wrong, because our print statement didn't print out the 10 lines of notifications. What's going on here? It turns out that when we first created this modeling app, we added modeling into the settings, but we didn't tell the Django project that we need to load the app config file. Let's make some changes. We replace modeling into modeling.apps.modeling config so that our Django project knows which configuration file for this app to load. Now let's go back to the terminal. Great. Our print statement is working and it seems like our model was loaded successfully. Great job. Now let's edit views.py file. We first import the modeling config class from the apps.py file, where we just loaded the prediction model. We then create an API function that takes an HTTP request as a parameter. We're expecting to get a query string from the GET request, and there will be a key called review. We then extract the content of the review and pass it over to a variable called review. We then use the model to make a prediction. If the result is 1, which means we have detected a positive sentiment, we label it as positive. Otherwise, we call it negative. In the end, we return the result back as a JSON string using the JSON response function. The safe equals false parameter tells Django that we can return any object inside of this JSON string. Otherwise, only a Python dictionary is going to be allowed by JSON response method. We now need to create a urls.py file so we can expose our API function. Inside the URL files, we first load the API sentiment prediction function from the views file. We then add a path to it so that all the HTTP requests that is routed by Django to this path will be answered by our API sentiment predict function. But before we can expose this API, we also need to include the URLs file that we just created on the project level. We will first open up the urls.py file under the sentiment analysis folder, which comes when we first created this project. We then import the include function, and then we specify the path so that every HTTP request that points to model/ will be handled by the modeling.urls file, which we just created. Let's first visit the URL that hosts our model. It seems like the URL is exposed successfully, but the problem is the review parameter is missing. So let's fix that. Let's say this movie is great. Now we're getting a result. So the server takes this review and then run it through a prediction model and return the result that's positive. Let's try another example. Total waste of time. we're getting negative result. Again, another example with negative result. One last example of a positive sentiment. We can also use curl to send out a GET request. In here, -g means that we're sending out a GET request to this specific address. We're using data URL encode so that we can easily include spaces inside of the URL string. In this lecture, you have learned how to set up your local API server that handles a GET HTTP request and classify whether the review is a positive sentiment or negative sentiment. In next lecture, I will show you how to productionize your local API server and handle any traffic from the internet. I will see you in the next lecture.